Well, one thing that you pointed out to me, Rania, and we'll get to this clip in just a second, but it's the question of like where things are going, how long this conflict could go. I mean, we know that just before the State of the Union, for instance, members of Congress were reporting that the Biden administration was reporting to them that this thing could last for decades in some way, which, was pretty eye-opening to me. But Rania, you pointed me to a clip of Hillary Clinton sort of speaking about this exact thing, right? About sort of where the conflict could potentially go. And we want to bring up this clip of Hillary. I think she might have been on ABC. I can't remember exactly where, but discussing, a number of things, but about sort of what the direction of the conflict could end up being.
But remember, the Russians invaded Afghanistan back in 1980. And although no country went in, they certainly had a lot of countries supplying arms and advice and even some advisors to those who were recruited to fight Russia. It didn't end well for the Russians. There were other unintended consequences, as we know. But the fact is that a very motivated and then funded and armed insurgency basically drove the Russians out of Afghanistan. Obviously, the similarities are not ones that you should bank on because the terrain, the development in urban areas, et cetera, is so different. But I think that is the model that people are now looking toward.
Well, Rania, I'd love to know your reactions to Hillary Clinton saying that the model that people are looking towards, the U.S. government, and I think Hillary Clinton would know, and Western governments, towards a mujahideen-style scenario.
I mean, what she's talking about, with that little smirk on her face, by the way, like she couldn't look more excited. What she's talking about as the model with this Afghanistan insurgency in the 1980s that had what she called unintended consequences. What were those unintended consequences? That was the seeding of what became Al-Qaeda. I mean, that's the unintended consequence we're talking about here. And then she said that that's the model for Ukraine. What's frightening about that is not only are we talking about essentially the U.S. and all its NATO allies funding and arming an insurgency to fight the Russians in Ukraine, there's a few things that are dangerous about this. First and foremost, where would these people be trained and how would they get weapons? They would be trained in neighboring NATO countries like Poland, which is where they would also get weapons from through those countries, which opens up a new front in this war that could potentially cause an actual war across Europe. Because as we know, if Russia, which is saying any outside power that intervenes, we will attack you. If Russia really means that, that could mean Russia going to attack a NATO power, a NATO country, that could trigger Article 5, and you've got yourself a war in Europe. And that's just one of many dangerous ways that such a quagmire could play out. The other danger of that is, okay, let's talk about the mujahideen. The most fanatical, ideological people are the ones who fight insurgencies like that. In the case of Afghanistan, it was religious, theocratic fascists. The same, by the way, for the model that was used in Syria, which, the Afghan Mujahideen model was used in Syria. We saw how terribly that went over the course of 10 years. And so if we're talking about the context of Ukraine, who are the most ideologically committed people in Ukraine? They're neo-Nazis. So you're talking about potentially an insurgency that could and probably already is attracting neo-Nazis and the far right from around the world to come have a training ground where they can fight an actual war. And then you've got yourself a problem that we could end up dealing with globally like we did and are still dealing with, by the way, with Al-Qaeda.
I think that's a really good summary of, I think, the dangers of this, Rania. And the thing that really struck me about that, exactly what you're saying, is it essentially means, at least what Hillary is saying is true, Secretary Clinton, is that essentially the West has given up on the idea of a diplomatic solution here, and that they're just, moving now to an insurgency status. And, a number of people noted that about the State of the Union, that Biden didn't really make any significant calls for peace. I saw the New York Times reporting something similar as what Secretary Clinton was saying, that people are thinking about an insurgency. So you've got the NATO forces who seem to essentially now have, sort of rubbished it. And I brought up the State of the Union specifically because Biden had said, and this has been repeated in the British Parliament by Boris Johnson, that, that this was unprovoked. No one could have known this happened. Russia was, totally, rejected all diplomatic circumstances. So I did a little research, Rania, because I knew that people had been predicting this for some time. And I found a WikiLeaks. And let me use this as an opportunity to also say we need to free Julian Assange. You can see it there in front of me, but I just, wanted to raise this because and I'll just summarize it for you here, the WikiLeaks, that's the highlighted piece there. I won't read the whole thing, but what it comes down to is the U.S. ambassador in Moscow met with Sergei Lavrov, who said specifically, and the ambassador is also noting other people were saying this in Russia at the time, that if the eastward expansion of NATO took place, that it could rip Ukraine in two, start a civil war, and if that took place, it would force Russia to decide whether or not to take military action. So in 2008, it was 100% clear. You have the ambassador writing to the State Department that the top Russian officials, including the current foreign minister then, saying this could lead to Ukraine being torn apart and Russia taking sides and potentially military intervening, which is exactly what took place. And to me is so important because it's sort of like, if there's a way out, if there's a way in, there was a way out. And there is a diplomatic way out, but it's just being rejected because it requires the United States and the West to give up on the, sort of imperial attitude towards Europe. But I'm sorry, I cut you off, Rania.
No. It's interesting to me this suddenly happened out of nowhere. I mean, how long ago was I'm not the best mathematician, Eugene.
Yeah, I mean, I am not either, but it was almost 2 decades ago.
2008 was a long time ago.
Yes. Yes.
So the U.S. has been aware of this, and this is why we've been talking about this on, I think, every episode that all of our programs on Breakthrough News that we put out on Breakthrough News on this issue. We've been pointing this out over and over again, and you've been really bringing this home as the idea that the answer here is not what's happening, which is to further militarize Europe, to pump more funding and weapons into NATO, but the opposite, to in fact dissolve NATO, because at the end of the day, that is the root of this problem. And this one WikiLeaks cable is one among many people saying over the years, this is the scenario that's going to play out if we continue down this path of NATO expansion and escalation. And it's exactly what happened. This did not happen out of nowhere. And it's so important for people to understand that. And it's not to say that there's no blame to be put on Russia for going through with this invasion. It's just to say that the stage was set by NATO and by the US. And now that it's set, and now that this has happened, exactly what's been predicted, what are they doing? They're escalating further, and it's terrifying because it's almost like we're this tiny little fish in like a sea, in an ocean of people who are screaming for more war and more escalation. And anybody who says the opposite or even questions it is like working for Putin. That's exactly right. That's the climate we're in right now.
That's exactly right. I mean, obviously, and we said this last week, it's not a question of supporting Russia invading into Ukraine, but it's, we have to talk about what it's going to take to have peace. And to have peace means that we can't take Russia invading Ukraine and say, well, that was wrong, and that means that everything that happened up to then is right. It means that everything that happened up to now brought us to a point of this tragic kind of happening because people were unwilling to listen to the calls for peace coming from civil society, coming from different governments in Western Europe and around the world to not, do this. And it's just really unbelievable that something so predictably, that could be so predictably avoided is just not being avoided. And I think that if we don't focus now, those of us in the United States, those of us in the West, on what is actually going to get us out of this quagmire. And it's certainly not going to be escalating sanctions and escalating troops and sending in more missiles. And it's absolutely not going to be starting an Afghanistan-style insurgency. I mean, the things that we're thinking about here, as you know, Rania, I'm a Virginian, and the saying we have down there is 2 wrongs don't make a right. I don't know if you have that saying in Northern Virginia, but just because you're angry about Russia invading Ukraine, it doesn't mean that the reverse is true, that the warmongering is true. But, one other thing go ahead.
Well, I think this is where you were going with this, but I also want to point out just with the whole idea of any voice that is against this escalation is somehow putting out Russian propaganda. It's also now becoming a situation of any voice warning about the objective reality of the neo-Nazi elements, the far-right elements. We're not saying all Ukrainians are neo-Nazis, but the fact that that element exists in the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian police is very important. And that now is being framed as something that's Kremlin propaganda, even though it's an issue that the mainstream media, the Atlantic Council, has reported on. Congress, people in Congress have noted this in limited weapons supplies in the past to Ukraine as a result of the inclusion of neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian military.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. The veneration of Steppen Bandera is probably the thing that's the most well-known. The Banderites who in World War II allied with the Nazis and, responsible for killing hundreds of thousands of people, Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, others, extraordinarily brutal stories of gouging people's eyes out and other things like that. And I just want to bring this up. A Zelensky quote. This is from Zelensky. And I just want to say for the record here, I do not view Zelensky as a Nazi, but I think just the fact that he says this speaks to the climate in the country that you have to say this. He's talking about Bandera, and he says, there are indisputable heroes. Steppen Bandera is a hero for a certain part of Ukrainians, and this is a normal and cool thing. He was one of those who defended the freedom of Ukraine. Now, obviously, Zelensky's a politician. I don't view him as a sympathizer of Nazis. I've never known him to do that. He's obviously Jewish, so I don't want people to think I'm accusing Zelensky, but I'm just trying to show the political environment in the country of Ukraine, that to be a successful politician, he felt he had to speak positively about Steppen Bandera, who was allied with the Nazis. He, was later put in jail, but his own forces, who started the UPA, an army allied with the Nazis, again, killed hundreds of thousands of people. And real quick, I want to play a clip that speaks to this. But before I do that, I want to bring up another quick screenshot if we can. And, I'm glad you brought up the point about Russian propaganda, because this next piece, which is about this Nazi group C-14 and the money they receive from the government, is from Bellingcat, which is like a CIA cutout. I don't know what else to call it, right?
I mean, literally,
and they're
people
reporting
who
on
have
this
called us
specifically.
Bellingcat hates us.
Yes, and I just want to quote from them. Documents analyzed by Bellingcat suggest that Ukraine's government apparently earmarked over $30,000 for projects by organizations linked to the National Corps and C-14. And those were actually educational programs. I'm not lying to you. Quote unquote patriotic education that was being carried out by people that everyone from, Bellingcat to the State Department to the OSCE considered to be Nazis. But before I get too carried away, I do want to play this clip. It's a little bit of a longer clip of this guy from C-14, a Nazi group, talking about the role of these far-right groups in Maidan, which I find to be quite revelatory.
Нам зараз надавали стільки зброї, не тому, що ми хороші, як нам кажуть, нам допомагає Захід, бо вони хочуть нам блага, тому що ми виконуємо задачі Заходу. Тому що ми єдині, хто готові їх виконувати, бо нам весело, нам прикольно убивати і прикольно воювати. І вони думають, вау, давайте вже подивимося, що це буде. Тому виник цей новий альянс, про який зараз говорять там Туреччина, Польща, Британія, Україна. Ми тут флагман, тому що ми затіяли війну, якої не було вже останніх 60 років. Так от, уявіть собі, скільки в нас зброї, скільки в нас ветеранів. А це є, вже йдеться про те, що нові політичні альянси вже глобального рівня, нові політичні виклики.
Wow.
Yeah, that's just some of it. The whole thing is actually on YouTube. there's so many different elements to it. Many of the things he says that, having 8 to 10% of Nazis was enough to control the whole Maidan, and he's, essentially mocking those who are saying, oh, it's only 8 to 10% of Nazis. He's saying a lot of homophobic things. He's going on and on about how they have all these weapons. It really just gives you a sense that these people are deeply embedded. So again, I think it's spurious to say Ukrainians are somehow Nazi sympathizers as a people. I don't think that's correct. I think it's unfair. I do not think that's the case for Zelensky as well, and I think, including many of the people in his party. But there's just no doubt that in the police and in the military, a number of these Nazi groups, C-14, by the way, had a deal with the Interior Ministry to be part of the police. They're getting tens of thousands of dollars from the government to educate young people. You've got the Azov Battalion. You had the official National Guard Twitter, showing that they were putting bullets in pig lard to kill Muslims from Chechnya.
Right.
So again,
Twitter had to cover it.
Yeah.
Twitter had to cover it as like something that was like evil. And you're not supposed to look at this.
Exactly. It's a tragic situation. And like I think we've said, like we said last week, like we said now, I myself, even though it's hard for me to bring myself to condemn it because I can see that NATO created this situation and set this up basically that it was guaranteed to happen. I think that in many ways the invasion has been based on falsehoods about, the so-called Soviet history of Ukraine and different things like that. I think that it's, done a lot of negative damage in many ways to some of the broader anti-imperialist strictures around the UN Charter and how to, control things and not just have a might makes right situation, but to be able to try to protect those who want to have an independent foreign policy. But we can't ignore the fact that the issue of far-right fascists being involved is real. We can't ignore the fact that the NATO push-up against Russia is real and is unjustified, and that it's the cause of it. And if we're not willing to talk about the hardcore right-wing nationalist politics, if we're not really willing to talk about what NATO did to essentially build the bomb, place the bomb, and light the fuse, we're never going to have peace. We're never going to be able to get out of this. And I think it's just unfortunate we're here.
Oh, 100%. And, I have to say, with the way the media is covering this, it's quite alarming that they're doing these things where not only are they downplaying what you just described, they're also promoting, like Sky News did like an instructional video on how to make a Molotov cocktail. There's people like embedding, I'm not going to name names, but there's people like embedding with these militias and justifying everything they're doing and portraying them as glorious. And it's only going to get there's foreign fighters being encouraged by Western governments to go fight in Ukraine, which is so reckless. But also, who do you think is going to be the most ideologically motivated? I mean, for the last several years, the media in the West, liberals, governments have been warning about the threat of far-right extremism and far-right violence. This is going to be where those people go. We already know that Americans in the far right have gone and trained in Ukraine with these people. And that is only going to get worse. And how the media covers it is so important.